This is Marc Mullinax. You're listening to Power for the Peaceful, a free podcast and class on Taoism that considers in numerical order each of the 81 verses of Tao Te Ching. This longer than usual episode explores some wide-ranging implications of verse 49 and is called Natural Grace.
When you listen to the ground and you put your roots down, you can hear what she says if you're listening. When you listen to the ground and you put your roots down, you can hear what she says if you're listening. The sweet sound of the river as she moves over the stones. The same song that the blood in your body sings as it weaves around your bones. When you're listening, are you listening?
One who is established in yoga is one with impartial vision everywhere, who sees one's God and oneself in all beings, and all beings and oneself as God. Bhagavad Gita 6:29.
Welcome back, one and all. Our reader's voice this week is Trent Moore on Zoom, who describes himself this way.
My name's Trent Moore. I live in Southern Ohio. I have studied anthropology at the University of Cincinnati and presently work as a welder at a small shop. Taoism has been something that's been an interest to me for a long time, and I'm pleased to be part of Marc's podcast.
So, Trent and everyone else, let's start with a philosophical question. We humans seem to develop these personalities, behaviors, senses of awareness, and identities throughout life. No one seems to be the same. Even twins born in a family are almost always, say their parents, radically different in the ways they act, behave, learn, and integrate into the family. Are these ways natural and nature, or something nurtured? Of course, that's a dualistic question with no real quick answer, but it's gotten me wondering, are we human beings born with a natural tendency to develop a sense of self? A self that is to be prized as unique, and thus we consider each human being as separate from all others with their senses of self? Or is this tendency a synthetic or secondary aspect of our makeup? Asked another way, is it more helpful to operate as if one's sense of self and identity is something one is born with, or something one develops, primary or secondary? Now, I know you're probably saying both, or both and. But we're told in Western societies, at least, to be somebody. Be yourself. What does that even mean? What is nature? What gets nurtured? We do develop a sense of self early on, in school, family, social context, from which we can develop more autonomy and confidence as a conscious and contributing part of society. We can be more honest about what we're capable of. In difficult situations, we can become more anchored and imbued with a sense of purpose to see us through. On the other hand, though, this ego development can morph into destructive narcissism with deficits in our sympathy and empathy for others. We can feel like we are self-made persons, not needing others, and therefore we can neglect family and friends. It can also lead to feeling isolated, alone, disconnected from others. There can be this pressure to be somebody that may lead some to identity crises, leading to anxiety, depression, abiding doubt, and self-doubt because of constant comparisons of our sense of self with others. So is our sense of self something that we all seem to develop? Is it natural and inborn, or artificial and then secondary? Something dependent upon where we are and when we are born. So here my philosophical considerations continue. If we have these sometimes helpful and sometimes not helpful senses of self, what are the consequences? Tao teaches that our first and primary tendency is peace, original peace. original blueprints, original instructions for peace lying at the taproot of who we are. This Taoist teaching shows up also in Buddhism and most earth-based spiritualities, traditions that do not see sin, hatred, war, or other such negative attributes that we humans are capable of as the first word about us. Well, what about this second tendency in us? That our identities are formed after our birth and can sometimes yield what seems to be artificial fixations, where we can develop tendencies to get robotically triggered and off-balanced by even ordinary circumstances in ways that seem out of sync with our original peace. This robotic tendency to see oneself as a willing prisoner or hostage of the ordinary circumstances seems so overwhelming in some spirituality paths, that is, they see that it is true, like in some constructions of Christianity. So adherents become so unquestionably self-critical of themselves, so much to the point that they would agree with their teachers in this Stockholm Syndrome rationale that the first word about me is my hopelessly entangled sin, aggression, and ego. Indeed, in this logic of being overwhelmingly entangled so that one feels spiritually overwhelmed that one can even help themselves, we must rely upon others to, quote, save me, unquote. And thus you have the philosophical divide between some religions in our world. There are spiritual traditions that feel that one's original peace is always there, though sometimes we may forget it, and our task as life is ever to return to our roots. Original peace is our storyline. And there are some other spiritual traditions that feel that our nature is the second tendency, the need to develop some sense of self. That is, in this second tendency, we inhabit these differing stories of who we are. Who we are depends upon when and where we're born. If so, are we merely prisoners, perhaps helplessly so, prisoners of societal precepts, cultural fixations, common myths, and shared habits of mind that we learn from other human beings, stories that seem to have convincing power to whisper that their stories speak to our real origins and our inevitable destinies. See the opening first few minutes of our treatment of verse 47 for more in my discussion about the two kinds of spirituality and how the deep well and gas station metaphors respectively describe these two tendencies. The first tendency of original peace seems natural to me. The second tendency seems unnatural and artificial, too dependent upon the time and place where one's born. Which one has the better life? In which one is one a walking civil war? In which one lives only reactively vis-a-vis events of your day? Tao study, to be clear, is our being reminded of our first and original tendency to peaceful living and learning to recognize and then dismiss those triggers that would keep us preoccupied with the second, and I would argue, the artificial, unnecessary stories of living in a coin-operated pinball machine of relentless, boomeranging reactivity. Today's verse explains that our original yoke or connection is Tao-rooted, peaceful, ever harmonic. Absent the drama of the second tendency, there's this cleared, pure environment of natural grace within, enabling a natural sort of leadership, oriented to service for others, and not one ever contending with one's self. Today's verse 49 makes clear, at least to me, that the Tao follower is a free leader among humans who models for others how to lead Taoist style. This is because that human leader has all creation in mind as they live, not just human beings and our reactive and maybe even radioactive dramas that postures as culture. A yoked with all creation leader sees the fullest possible vision of creation, that peace is in every particle of creation, in every process of evolution of the universe, and thus in every atom of life. And that leader, like water, engages all, circulates among all, brings beauty to all. At the end of today's verse is the logical outcome of being born in original peace. we see the first of 3 golden rules in Tao Te Ching. The golden rule teaches not merely to reactively do as you are done by, but rather to initiate radical mercy and model the natural graces of serving both creation and other human beings that ratchets up the virtue of everyone and everything within that Taoist's sphere of influence, whether that sphere is geographical or place-based, or temporal, and both timely and timeless. So, Trent, let's hear verse 49.
Verse 49, the yoked leader. Without a hardened agenda, the sage has no interfering interests of her own. She merges her heart-mind with the people. To those who trust her and do good to her or not, it is her nature to treat as trustworthy and good. Meeting everyone with virtue, she ratchets up every person's virtue. In governing and being part of the world, the sage wisely yokes her heart-mind with the people. They rivet their attention on her because the sage nurtures them as she would a child.
Things to notice. Without a hardened agenda. Interfering interest. Merging. Treating everyone with virtue ratchets up everyone else. And nurtures them as she would with a child. There's only one question here for the Tao seeker. How can I be helpful to others? This was Teresa of Avila's query for her entire life. This chapter, as well as the rest of Tao Te Ching, is plainly trying to remind, return, and reorient us to our ancestral self, our original self of natural grace, and free us, to some degree, from civilization's hierarchical mindset that colonizes us from infancy. Mindful of constant Tao within, one then is liberated from society's cages of false expectations, worries, right versus wrong moralities, and to become agendaless, intentionless, helpful companions of all. Perhaps the most radical act of resistance in society is to live without reaction to it, and live in relation to it with grace. The Chinese text for verse 49's first line, without a hardened agenda, literally reads, without a predisposed heart-mind. This is a heart-mind totally free from presets. It is a mind impartial, not prejudiced, not colonized by ordinary opinions or feelings, without an abscessed interest in its own self-promotion. And when I say free of presets, I mean really free of the ordinary intentions that most of us walk around with, especially in this a pivotal election year. Why? Because Taoist sages merge into others and take on the intentions of others and model how to be shot free of them. There is no liberal or conservative in the scenario, no derivative senses of right or wrong, for both dichotomies have presets and desires for certain outcomes, which every Tao follower should understand is bondage. Instead, I speak of the mind spoken about in Tao Te Ching's first verse, about a conceptually free mind, the kind of emptied mind that enables one to perceive the essence of the universe without filters, to see the world's true nature, no filters of left or right or other prejudging filters. This important theme in Taoism is the prescription for the hijacked senses of self we do develop. For what we call today good or bad are the results of, I think, temporary delusions, the products of deluded minds hell-bent on certain outcomes. Remember, Taoism is not about changing the world, but reminding us about how we have changed it. Remember the theme of verse 2 above? The Taoist sage is careful of perceiving differences and distinctions where there are none. Otherwise, one acts upon hallucinations.
As the Taoist philosopher Su Che said, emptiness has no form. It takes on the form of the 10,000 things. If emptiness had its own form, it could not form anything else. Thus, the sage has no mind of his own. He takes on the minds of the people and treats everyone the same.
The Taoist mind is empty, remember, so it may receive, not own. The Tao mind has stilled desire, so it may respond and not react. In the middle of verse 49 is Tao Te Ching's first of three sayings that compare to the Golden Rule. The other two are in verses 54 and 63.
To those who trust her and do good to her or not, it is her nature to treat as trustworthy and good. Meeting everyone with virtue, she ratchets up every person's virtue.
Notice how the sage does not wait to be treated well first. Where is she to wait? Who would then make the first move of virtue? In the spiritual economy of Taoism, it's always your initiative. No matter the scenario, the great in Taoism is the servant of all, modeling a triggered, free mind. And the Taoist does not even develop or reserve space within for the awareness of some temporal or temporary cause. I mean, we're talking big picture, deep time, full frame. The sage has a mind like a newborn baby's, pure, impartial, open and receptive to all.
Ron Hogan phrases part of verse 49 this way: a master throws himself into the world completely, forgetting everything he's been told. People pay attention to him because he lives a life of childlike wonder.
So this verse treats how the uncolonized mind of the Taoist is the mind of what has been called in modern times the servant leader. Now, what's a servant leader? Of the several kinds of leadership, is the quietest, the most patient. Those led by such a leader are rarely aware of it. Like agape love is described in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Servant leadership suffers long. It does not envy or parade itself around. It is not puffed up with ego and pride because it does not seek its own interests. It bears, believes, hopes, and endures all. Such sorts of practices are not usually practiced by leaders who lead by ego and its siren calls that to be a leader one must have this huge PR staff to promote him. He must be often and heavily praised by that leader's minions. And most of all, he must be seen as a standalone hero, providing a Hollywood-like quick solution to an intractable or long-standing problem. That is, without him, society fails. Now, leaders who want to be recognized, who lead by ego, and need their egos ever stroked, see little value in sacrificial service to others. They get easily triggered. Servant leadership leads by serving, of course, and that servant does not mind being incognito, not being seen as second, third, or last. It does not get triggered. The servant leader makes life more bearable for everyone they touch. She or he does not mind slowing down for, listening to, or even touching the last, the least, the most unpopular, and those considered too low or too worthless to acknowledge. A servant leader does not pretend to know the quick fix for any problem. Servant leaders take their time and use that time to empower others to be who they are intended and meant to be, peaceful beings. Servant leaders take the path to justice, for the servant leader seeks to restore, or as I like to phrase it, to re-story a bad situation and help to reframe it or make it into a good story, a re-story, a restoration. As the Beatles sang in Hey Jude, and they are right.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better.
For example, a servant leader knows her students well enough to custom tailor her lesson plans for each student, so that the lesson the student learns is the lesson they may most need to learn at that time. But a non-servant leader, teacher, sees students only as pliable dough for his or her cookie-cutter pedagogies. A servant business person is more concerned for matching their business mission with their customers and clients. Profits take a back seat to the well-being of the business's workers and customers alike. A servant leader mindset does not noise itself about or make a scene. They do not need to be at the center of attention or in charge. Servant leaders nourish and feed all in their care. To have one person or one class of people going lacking is a telling commentary on that leader's quality or ability. A servant never stops, just like Tao practice. Just as every musician plays scales and they never stop playing scales. Just like every baseball player practices batting and never stops it. Practicing being of service to others is how Taoists practice their own fundamental skills, like all the time. The more one practices service leadership, the more tuned one is to others, the more attuned one is to Tao. Servant leadership sharpens the most basic skill in a person, to recognize anyone as one's own mirror image, as an extension of oneself. Today one serves, tomorrow one is the served.
One who is established in yoga is one with impartial vision everywhere, who sees one's God and oneself in all beings, and all beings and oneself as God.
This is the cycle. Sometimes you're yin, sometimes yang. Sometimes you're the boat rower, sometimes you get rowed. Sometimes you're the educator, other times one is the schooled. Sometimes you're the orchestra player, sometimes you're the conductor. Servant leaders do this all the time. They take bad stories and quietly, without fanfare, help turn them into better stories. Servant leaders are like earthworms. Out of sight, they take on the crap of the world and turn it into fertilizer. They are the pottery maker who turns mud into something beautiful, quietly, softly, out of the way, out of the spotlight. They are like the conductor of an orchestra who does not make a sound herself, but leads powerfully by enabling others to make powerful sounds. The key image here, of course, for servant leadership in Taoism is water. What does water do? Water quietly and naturally flows down to the lowest places. Water shifts itself into the cracks and crevices where nothing else can go, and there quietly works its revolution. Water cleans, clears, quietly starts to smooth the sharp edges. Over time, water changes a place completely, quietly, enduring all things. A few million years later, water takes a landscape and turns it into the Grand Canyon, Antelope Canyon. This is how Tao works. This is how Tao servant leadership works. Margaret Atwood, the acclaimed American novelist, wrote,
"Water does not resist. Water flows. When you plunge your hand into it, all you feel is a caress. Water is not a solid wall. It will not stop you. But water always goes where it wants to go, and nothing in the end can stand against it. Remember, you are half water. If you can't go through an obstacle, go around it. Water does." Margaret Atwood, The Penelopiad.
So this is servant leadership. This is what Taoists do. Because being of service for peace is our first tendency, not our second. It's who we are. It's okay that no one will remember us for that long. We're not investing in outcomes. We're not triggered by events, but invest grace and peace into every situation. May this tendency accompany you throughout this difficult year, one fraught with ego-assisted schemes and people vying for our attentions. For we are all, as we are made to live as, just drops of water, doing our part, as empty of desires and purpose and agenda as water, just doing its thing. But when we take some sad song in the world and make it better, we change that person and their environment for a lifetime, and their family feels the effects for generations. This is the work of
one who sees one's God and oneself in all beings, and all beings and oneself as God.
For here's the truth. Each of us listening to this podcast can testify that our lives have been changed for the better due to the quiet leadership of people you may not even know, enabling us to be here today, alive, thriving, and now we get to do the same for others, whether they are born or not yet born. This is our everyday homework. And now, Trent, your question, please.
Thanks, Mark. Since the Tao is pragmatic, is it that the sage is empty, receiving all other hearts and minds without resolving apparent contradictions? Because to the perfect mirror of her mind, there are no contradictions. Is she yoked to the people and the people yoked to her because she understands the illusion of separation, the illusions of distinctions? My most important question, then, if this is so, how would a sage in modern America engage with all the fragments and factions we find today, as each segment of society invents ever new distinctions between one another? The nub of my reasoning is the basic empirical question: where does the rubber meet the road?
Oh, Trent, thank you. You asked a question I have been asking ever since a recent Unitarian Universalist Taoist class I was part of kept on pressing me. What can a wise social justice mandate in a year like 2024 actually look like? If Taoism is peace, then how can a group motivated by Taoism bring the rubber of peace to the roads of the world, if it can? One could begin by saying that 2024 does seem to be a unique year, a pivotal year. Perhaps listeners in the future to this episode will recognize that uncertainty in this crazy year of U.S. politics, a year that could actually rewrite politics and justice for years or even decades to come. But then again, is this so different from other years in the U.S. past when so much was to be decided politically or militarily? These days today are fraught with uncertainty, threats of violence and reprisal, and no one's backing down. Everyone's playing favorites and backing their hardened preset preferences with increasing violence. So the point is, pivotal years and times like this one are frequent visitors to us, no matter the year. So what would a Taoist sage do or advise? First of all this is part of my learning these days. I feel like a baby. But I suggest some Taoist sage distinctives that could deviate broadly from the usual fragmentation and factious discord of our days. And I think the Taoist would not react at all, first of all. A Taoist would not even pressure anyone, for to react is the first arrow in the quiver of someone needing to control things. Reaction. The reaction-based participant has rarely been a good master in any situation. And why is that? Because in reaction mode, we don't have the best interest of everyone at heart. A person in reaction mode, their vision is clouded by conflicting interest, not by the single-minded and single-hearted vision of being of service. A Taoist doesn't react. A Taoist responds. As the verse says,
To those who trust her and do good to her or not, it is her nature to treat as trustworthy and good. Meeting everyone with virtue, she ratchets up every person's virtue. What I'd like to add, uh, I think what's really great when you said you feel like a baby, it makes me think of, I think in Buddhism and perhaps in Taoism as well, they talk about the beginner's mind.
yeah, very much so. Yeah. Yeah. And that's and that beginner's mind does not add. It just it goes to essentials. Yeah. Well, to continue, the sage's mission might include the prevention of people acting foolishly in ways that would cause regret. The sage does not wield tools to control things or situations or doesn't need to control people, because these are not for the sage to control. They're not meant for them to control. If a person or group is hell bent on destruction, mayhem, or conspiracy, there's little that can dismay them except maybe or perhaps or hopefully to be dismayed by the surprise of a Taoist sage's natural grace. But to the end, a Taoist sage would counsel and model wise listening, non reactivity, graceful rephrasing of what they hear to make sure everyone gets heard. But they would not take sides. They would offer a third alternative, going slow, pausing for minds and hearts to catch up with one another, seeing possible reframing stories born out of a beginner's mind instead of some hardened expert worldview, and the surprising grace of not meeting someone's strong emotions with equally strong emotions. That can always be a surprise. It's so revolutionary to not meet strong reactions with your own strong reactions. So reacting in kind is ever the recipe for escalation, for spittle erupting from one's anger contorted mouth, for that tit for tat payback, and then massaging that resentment of past alleged wrongs to motivate paybacks today and in the future. So they would not seek to be, as one presidential candidate recently said, a dictator, except on day one of my administration. So remember that Tao was, like its contemporaries in China, Buddhism and Confucianism, a measured spiritual response to the winner-take-all military politics of its day. That warring states period was like our year 2024, but for a time period that was centuries long, not just a year or two of a here today, gone tomorrow political crisis like we have here. Taoism offered then, and I think it still does today, a clear alternative, not getting engaged in reactionary politics. For when you get married to your times, you soon get controlled by your marriage partner. So the sage is always advising, don't start that payback game. It reminds me when my older brother and I were kids in the back seat of the car, and an argument arose, usually about where the dividing line was between us. And soon there were words, and then shoving, and then hitting, and yelling, and hitting back reaction and payback. "What's going on back there?" demanded a parent's voice from up front. And one time I mistakenly but truthfully replied, "It all started when he hit me back." So the sage knows that the lines in the sand, the insane politics, and the demands that one side only is right, these are not sage's tools. As verse 74 will teach us in a few months, to usurp heaven's ways is no different from trying to impersonate a skilled carpenter with his tools. It's likely the first thing you'll do is cut your hand. Or as J.H. McDonald phrases that same idea, those who harm others are like inexperienced boys trying to take the place of a great lumberjack. Trying to fill his shoes will only get them seriously hurt. And verse 79 is relevant here, and I'll speak it in its entirety. It's called keeping faith, not score. Once you've made peace after a bitter dispute, why keep circulating bad blood? How do you repurpose any lingering resentments towards your common good? Consider how sages hold gracefully to their positions in contracted obligations. They keep faith by not pressuring the other party. The virtuous focus on their obligations with others. Win-win. The unvirtuous focus only upon the scorecard of what others owe them. Lose-lose. Heaven's Tao plays no favorites. Anyone keeping faith is already synchronizing with Tao. So I'll just make a little conclusion here, then ask if you have an intermediate reaction to me. The sage is not guided so much from the past wrongs and injustices, and not by present lines drawn in the sand or between car seats, but by the way of constant and natural grace, no matter what happens. How do we prevent dragon's teeth to be sown? How to meet the factions in today's splintered world? How to stop violence that, first of all, always and ever spirals, and second, colonizes yet more generations to come into accepting violence as somehow inevitable? Not by being aloof or distanced, but as seeing everyone and everything as oneself, constantly. Because what we do to the web of life, we do to ourselves. This has always been the constant rule of life. This is the golden rule. This golden rule is not something that you wait for someone to initiate with you. No, the sage initiates the golden rule and surprises a tense situation with grace shown to one's enemy. It's the epigraph at the top of today's episode from the Bhagavad Gita.
One who is established in yoga is one with impartial vision everywhere, who sees one's God and oneself in all beings, and all beings and oneself as God.
So, Trent, I'm not finished yet, but what do you think so far?
So several things come to mind. Yeah, I once read a book on Taoist meditation, translated by Thomas Cleary, I think, and there was an anecdote where a Chan Buddhist was asked uh, by a layman to explain the mystery of right and wrong. How do you distinguish? How do you live a right life and navigate all the wrongs? And the Chan Buddhist replied, right is right and wrong is wrong, but right is not right and wrong is not wrong. And it was only years later that I started to understand maybe what he meant, which is that right is right, wrong is wrong, but that isn't all they are, because right includes wrong and wrong includes right.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the whole meaning of the yin and yang symbol.
Exactly. Yeah.
The whole includes, it doesn't separate. And
Right. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and in terms of on the political side of things, I'm not partisan myself, because partisanship appears to me to be the basic problem.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I often think of what one of our presidents said generations ago: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That
Mm-hmm.
sense of responsibility,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
sense of virtue,
Right. Yeah.
what you can add, and not
Yeah.
what somebody else owes you.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think
Looking.
that's valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. That rhymes with what I say in the episode about uh, service leadership or servant leadership, and that is to take in all that you see and just become a servant to it, much like water does. It doesn't discriminate about who it gets wet. It just treats everybody the same.
Indeed.
Okay. All right. Jesus said, "The one without fault can throw the first stone." And that seems to be a good Taoist position. Can we walking wounded folks use our hurts to become wounded healers of others and see through all the eyes of grace and not with the eyes of vengeance and payback? There's a Persian proverb. It says, "The one who returns good for evil is as a tree which renders its shade and its fruit, even to those who cast stones at it." And I like that proverb. So, to conclude, Trent, there are some things that we are not meant to control. All we can do is take the long view and create in Taoist fashion this rule free, ego free, and thus conflict free zones, whether one's a parent, a teacher, or someone just bewildered by circumstances, and begin where we are to provide alternative models of servant leadership and leading with what I hope is our natural inclinations of being graceful to all, because God knows our contexts today are often graceless. So I'd love to hear anything you'd like to conclude with if you like the last word.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. One thing that I reflect upon often as I, in my own life, deal with people who have strong opinions about those who are different from them,
Yeah.
who may be prejudicial toward various people. I try to practice listening more than reacting, primarily because, from a practical perspective, reacting is seldom fruitful.
Yeah.
I'm not likely to convince them to believe differently. And if I ever were to convince them to believe differently, I understand that it's critical that I listen and understand them first. Um, and as I've done this over time, what I've found is people who disparage others, even hate others, whether it's gay people or black people or Democrats or Republicans or whoever.
Yeah.
What I often feel is that they're afraid.
Yeah.
They feel hurt one way or another.
Yeah.
And when you realize that and you examine your own pain and your own hurt, as I've examined my own, you realize everybody is terrified
Yeah.
and everybody's hurt all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not understanding that and not understanding that your own consciousness is the consciousness of everyone else that leads to all these misunderstandings.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right. Whatever the answer is, and perhaps there is no answer, but it surely begins with pausing and listening.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody has ever been convinced of by to change their minds by force. Nobody. As a parent, it just doesn't work. You cannot force anybody to change their mind. And by forcing somebody to change their mind, you break something in them that is hard to repair. And it's horrible. But yeah. So uh, we get defensive when fearful. And we got to I think we have to listen to others and help them to explore, like we do ourselves, our fears. And once we can name our fears, especially if it's over a cup of coffee or a mug of beer, I think you're going to get folks, I hope, my fingers are crossed, that then we can see common cause, maybe for the very first time, however small it may be. And we can leave the situation, that bar, that coffee house, we can leave that place understanding that something important happened. We actually listened and saw each other as real people. And that's what a Taoist does. All right. What else? Anything?
Um, no, I think that summarizes or ends our discussion nicely. I mean,
Okay.
we could probably talk for hours. I suspect if we really got into it.
Yeah.
Um, but no, I think that's good.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. And thanks for being the part of this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
This podcast remains an original labor of love, designed, written, and co-produced by many, whose central idea is that Tao Te Ching is good news for today. Tao still speaks. Thank you, Trent Moore, for your voice and question. Thank you, Audrey Davis, for being our artist, and please notice, everyone, her updated artwork for this podcast. Molly Hartwell, thank you for donating your song, Put Your Roots Down. Fortress Press holds the copyright for quotations from my Tao Te Ching translation. May your days begin in peace and remain wombs for radical hope.